Good morning. It is Monday, May 4th, 2026. This is your deep dive daily briefing. I am your anchor, delivering a comprehensive analysis of the pivotal events that have defined the last 24 hours. We begin our broadcast on the world stage, where the strategic landscape of the Middle East has entered a phase of intensified friction following the formal expiration of the two-week diplomatic window. As of this morning, May 4th, the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports remains in full effect, a mission that has now entered its fourth week. According to reports from United States Central Command, the blockade is being enforced by over 10,000 personnel supported by more than a dozen warships, effectively neutralizing Iran's maritime exports and costing the regime an estimated $500 million daily. In direct retaliation, Tehran has maintained its closure of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, while simultaneously implementing a controversial toll system for specific vessels from friendly nations. With the collapse of the Islamabad talks, the risk of a military flare-up remains at a hair-trigger, as both Washington and Tehran engage in a high-stakes standoff that has paralyzed one of the world's most sensitive maritime corridors.
Transitioning from the front lines of conflict to the broader global economy, the narrative is being dictated by the mounting inflationary pressure and the structural impact of these energy supply disruptions. The World Bank and the United Nations have issued supplementary analyses this morning, projecting that global energy prices will surge by an average of 24% this year, marking the most severe shock to commodity markets since 2022. This persistent volatility is manifesting in retail markets, with United States gasoline prices averaging $3.70 per gallon and diesel climbing toward $4.80. Economists warn that the global manufacturing sector is entering a stagflationary trap, as the combination of triple-digit oil prices and record-high metal costs erodes industrial margins. While some major economies have shown relative resilience, the cumulative pressure of high energy costs is beginning to weaken consumer demand and complicate the fiscal policy buffers of emerging markets.
In the realm of finance, all eyes are on the transition of power at the Federal Reserve as market participants process the implications of a central bank facing historic internal division. Last week's final policy meeting under Chair Jerome Powell, which saw the highest number of dissenting votes since 1992, has set the stage for Kevin Warsh to assume the chairmanship on May 15. At his confirmation hearing, Warsh pledged to uphold a narrow mandate focused on price stability, signaling a potential move to aggressively reduce the Fed's balance sheet to correct market distortions. Institutional investors are currently navigating a global debt pool that has surpassed $315 trillion, with the 10-year United States Treasury yield settled near 4.3%. This restrictive financial environment suggests that the era of cheap capital is effectively over, as the Fed prepares for a regime change that will likely prioritize crushing persistent inflation over supporting near-term growth.
Turning our attention to the technology sector, the focus remains on the massive infrastructure supercycle required to sustain the agentic AI era amidst an increasingly unstable energy landscape. Industry leaders have reached a consensus that energy infrastructure, rather than computing capability, is now the primary constraint for AI development. In response, tech giants are aggressively pivoting toward nuclear energy as a means of securing 24/7 baseload power. This week has seen a surge in interest for small modular reactors, with companies like X-Energy collaborating with regional utilities to deploy advanced nuclear technology for data center hubs. Simultaneously, the historic effort to restart decommissioned nuclear units, such as those at 3 Mile Island, highlights a new reality where energy security is now as critical to technological leadership as software innovation. The industry is effectively attempting to decouple its digital infrastructure from a volatile global power grid that remains vulnerable to geopolitical shocks.
Finally, we look at the logistics and supply chain networks that serve as the vital arteries of global commerce, which are now undergoing a permanent structural rewiring due to the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. With the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal remaining largely inaccessible, the maritime industry has finalized its transition to the Cape of Good Hope as the primary route for Asia to Europe trade. This detour, which adds up to 14 days to transit times and absorbs 6% of global fleet capacity, is no longer being treated as a temporary workaround. Logistics professionals report that 72% of trade volume originally intended for these choke points has been permanently rerouted. This represents a total abandonment of the low-cost, just-in-time models that defined the previous era of globalization, as shippers accept a new reality of regional inventory buffers and permanent cost premiums to insulate world trade from unpredictable geopolitical fragmentation.
In summary, the global landscape is currently defined by a stalled diplomatic process in the Middle East that has triggered a significant energy shock and left the Federal Reserve in a divided holding pattern. Technological innovation in energy-independent data centers is accelerating, while the global shipping industry settles into a high-cost, permanent detour around Africa. Based on the current trajectory, I predict that the transition at the Federal Reserve on May 15 will lead to a more hawkish and reform-minded policy stance that will keep interest rates higher for longer than many market participants currently anticipate. The world has learned that reliance on singular maritime choke points is a liability that can no longer be ignored, and even if a diplomatic breakthrough occurs this month, the structural shifts toward regional inventory buffers and energy-independent industrial hubs will remain a permanent fixture of the global economy through the remainder of 2026.